When performance IQ and full-scale IQ were controlled for, the entire phenomenon disappeared. In other words, no differences in language between the two groups were observed, except on one subtest that I shall go back to earlier. So one can say that the entire difference in the language scales was due to the differences in intelligence. So here here's the data, except for the last subtest, which is formulating sentences under self-3. Nothing really remained significant after you control for intelligence. The analysis of spontaneous speech did not show any difference, either in the frequency of use of grammatical forms, in the percentage of errors between the two groups. Both groups used a similar range of syntactic structures, and altogether, both groups made very few errors. So, summary of the results. It seems that siblings of nonverbal children with autism perform worse than controls on language tests. However, differences disappear when you control for IQ, and there were no differences in the spontaneous speech. So the conclusion would therefore be that intellectual deficits seemed accountable for the relatively poor performance of siblings of nonverbal children on the self, and language, therefore, does not seem to be part of the broad autism phenotype. But is intelligence part of the broad autism phenotype in families with a low-functioning autistic kid? Now, the relevance of language to the phenotype to the autism phenotype has been largely debated. I don't think I can get into this in very great detail here. Let me just point out that whereas research did not find correlation between IQ and severity of autistic features, most studies reported low intelligence in siblings of children with autism. So in that respect, our findings replicated what has been consistently reported. Siblings of children with autism have generally low intelligence. So a prior question I would like to point out that a prior question concerns the methodology of the studies. Are we using the right batteries to assess IQ? Remember, we used a Wechsler test, and the reason we used a Wechsler test is because others have used a Wechsler test, and we wanted to have comparable results. But are we using the right batteries? At least I can't get into the detail of this entire question, but let me just point out a study by Dawson from 2007 in which he suggested that intelligence may have been underestimated in the autistic population because of the frequent use of the Wechsler test. Now, the Wechsler test has a verbal component. We're not talking about a verbal component. We're talking about the general characteristic of the test. This is a test that various Wechsler tests, that is introduced through verbalization. That uses a lot of language in the nonverbal parts as well. If you use the Raven, for example, to study autistic population, what you see is a difference, a significant difference between scores that these children obtain on the Raven versus scores they obtain on the Wechsler. So if you use the Raven, you get higher estimate of their intelligence relative to what you get on the Wechsler. Such discrepancies are not seen in typically developing children. Now, what about language, which is the focus of this talk anyway? Is this accurately assessed through the self? And I would like to point out that the self, again, The reason I use the self is because everybody uses the self, or something equivalent to the self. I could point out at least 3 other tests that are frequently used and are very similar in the way they have been constructed. But is the self the right tool to assess language? Remember, I pointed out in the beginning that we're using language in 2 ways. Language in its broad sense encompasses social understanding, conceptual understanding, pragmatics of the conversation. But this is closely tied to social, non-language social understanding, to conceptual, non-language conceptual understanding. Is the self really appropriate for testing language? Here are a few examples why I think it is not the right tool to assess language. So, for example, in the sentence construction task, which was one of the subtests on the self 3, children are given words and they are asked to construct sentences. 18 of the 22 words that are in this subtest are either comparative adjectives, so John is bigger is a comparative adjective, or relational terms, or logical conjunctions, such as if then, despite the fact that, or nevertheless. So in order to construct a sentence with if then, you have to understand conditionals. And is conditional, the understanding of conditional, a language thing, or is it, first of all, a conceptual thing? We can't really distinguish those two. But if we cannot distinguish those two, then testing language through this may be biased, may be just the wrong way to go about it. The subtest called concept and directions, or semantic relations, these directly test conceptual understanding, while a subtest called recalling sentences challenges the child with items, sentences that are 16 words long. So this is how good your working memory has to be in order to score high on this item. On the self-P, which is meant for preschoolers, linguistic concepts tests logical operators such as or, next to, first, last, before, after. Recalling sentences, this is preschoolers, requires 11 items, 11 words long sentences. And basic concepts really test attributes and definitions, which directly implicates conceptual understanding. So, my conclusion from this is that the self does not allow the separation of language from conceptual understanding. And therefore, the fact that we saw that intelligence really controlled all the significant correlations we found on the language was not really surprising. To summarize, siblings of nonverbal children with autism do not show language deficits that are independent of their cognitive level. And there's a caveat here. Testing subjects on the self and the Wechsler allowed comparisons with previous work for our study. But are these tests looking at language proper? Now, clearly, my answer to this is no. These are the wrong tests to use. And language studies in autism may benefit from supplementing normative tests, such as the self, with experimental tasks that have been widely used in the study of aphasia and in the study of specific language impairment, S&I, where grammar has been very carefully dissociated from cognition and therefore allow us to say something about language proper, independent of conceptual and social understanding. Thank you very much.